The boy had always lived a quiet life. People in his neighborhood would often see him walking to school with his head slightly lowered, his backpack hanging loosely off one shoulder, and his step soft like he was trying not to bother the world around him. He never tried to stand out. He was the kind of person most people passed by without even realizing he was there. But those who paid attention could sense something different about him, a kind of depth in the way he listened, the way he watched everything with calm eyes. That seemed older than his age. His mother worked long hours at a small store. She left the house early and often came home late, tired from standing all day. Even though she was exhausted, she always tried to make time for him. They didn't have much money, but she gave him all the love she could. He understood that, and even though he missed her often, he never complained. Instead, he tried to make things easier for her. He woke up early to help with small chores. He studied quietly without being told. He cooked simple meals when he could. And whenever he felt lonely, he would sit near the old piano they kept in the living room. The piano wasn't anything special. The paint had faded, the keys were yellowed, and a few notes sounded a little off if played too hard. But to him, it was priceless. His grandfather had given it to them before he passed away. His grandfather was the one who had taught him how to play when he was still a small child. He remembered those early mornings when his grandfather would wake him up gently and say, "Music is a friend that never leaves you. Treat it well." Those words stayed with him through everything. But after his grandfather passed, he slowly stopped playing for others. The joy he once felt became mixed with sadness. Every time he touched the keys, memories came back, warm ones, but also painful ones. And so, he played only when he was alone. He didn't want people listening. He didn't want anyone asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. School wasn't easy for him either. He wasn't bullied, but he wasn't included either. He ate lunch alone most days. He did group projects quietly, letting others take the lead. When teachers asked him to speak, he did so in a soft voice that often went unheard. Some students thought he was strange. Others simply forgot he was in their class. Only one or two people noticed he wasn't as invisible as he pretended to be. At the community center, where he helped after school, he mostly cleaned tables, stacked chairs, and organized books in the small reading room. He liked the place because it was peaceful and the people there were kind. They didn't push him to talk, and they appreciated his help. And on certain evenings, when the building grew quiet, he would walk into the small music room and sit at the old piano there. The keys were warm, but they reminded him of home. He would play softly, keeping the notes gentle so no one would hear from outside. But sometimes, when his emotions were too heavy, his hands would move without thinking, and a sound full of feeling would fill the room before he could stop himself. Those moments scared him a little, because he didn't want anyone to discover this part of him, the part he had kept hidden for so long. One day at school, an announcement was made about the annual talent show. It was a big event where the music director chose students to perform. The director was known for being strict and dramatic. He enjoyed showing off his power and loved telling everyone how high his standards were. Most students respected him, but they also feared him. He had a habit of mocking anyone who didn't meet his expectations. The boy didn't care about the talent show. He had no plans to join. He wasn't looking for attention. But his quiet routine changed when one of his classmates, someone who had seen him at the community center once, mentioned to another student that she thought he knew how to play piano. She hadn't heard him directly, but she remembered seeing him near the music room. Soon, whispers began spreading. People were curious. Some didn't believe it. Others laughed at the thought. How could the quiet boy know anything impressive? He never spoke. He never showed emotion. He always kept to himself. A rumor like that They thought must have been a mistake. The rumor reached the director's ears too. When he heard it, he responded with a loud laugh that echoed in the hallway. "Him? Play the piano?" he said with disbelief. "If that boy plays the piano, I'll kneel right on the stage." Students laughed with him. They found the idea ridiculous. The director repeated his bold statement again in front of a few teachers, adding more dramatic flair each time. He enjoyed the attention, as if the idea of the quiet boy performing was nothing more than a joke. The boy heard about this through whispers. At first, he didn't react. He simply looked down and kept walking. He didn't like attention, whether it was good or bad. The thought of being involved in a public performance frightened him. He didn't want to stand in front of a crowd. He didn't want people looking at him. Music was private, personal. It was his way of remembering his grandfather. It wasn't something he wanted to share, but a part of him felt uneasy. It wasn't the laughter or the rumors. It was the feeling that someone had insulted something he held close. Not him personally, but the music itself, the connection he had with it. His grandfather's memory dot as the days passed. One of his classmates approached him gently. This classmate wasn't the pushy type, just kind and observant. They sat beside him during lunch and said in a soft voice, "I heard you might know how to play. If you do, maybe you should try. Not for them, for yourself." The boy didn't answer right away. He stared at his hands, thinking deeply. He remembered the mornings with his grandfather, the scent of tea filling the air, the soft tapping of fingers on keys, the warmth of being told he had a gift. His chest tightened at the memory dot after school. He walked to the community center. Like he always did. He finished his tasks quietly, then went to the music room and closed the door behind him. He sat at the piano and rested his fingers on the keys without pressing them. He stayed like that for a long time, lost in thought. Then slowly, he began to play. He didn't play anything fancy at first, just a simple melody his grandfather had taught him. But as the notes filled the air, he felt something inside him loosen. The heaviness in his chest lightened. His hands moved more freely. His breath slowed, and warmth spread through him. He closed his eyes and let the music guide him. What he didn't realize was that someone was standing outside the door. The same classmate who had spoken to him earlier had come to return a book to the reading room and had stopped when they heard the music. They didn't open the door or interrupt. They stood quietly, listening with wide eyes. They had never heard anything like it from a student their age. The next day, more whispers filled the school. The classmate didn't tell anyone what they heard, but someone else had walked past the hallway and caught a few notes of the music through the small window. Word spread faster this time. People grew curious. Some doubted even more. Others became strangely excited, as if waiting for something unexpected to happen. The director was irritated by how often his name and his old declaration were being brought up. He didn't like rumors distracting students from what he considered serious work. So he made another announcement, this time louder, more dramatic, and in the presence of more teachers. "If that boy truly plays even one proper piece," he boomed, "I will kneel right here in this auditorium. Mark my words." Students laughed again. Teachers raised their eyebrows. The boy simply listened quietly, but something had changed in him. That evening, when he returned home, he walked straight to the piano in the living room. His mother watched him with surprise. She hadn't seen him play openly in years. He sat down, placed his hands gently on the keys, and began to play a soft tune. She didn't interrupt. She stood in the doorway, covering her mouth with her hand. Feeling tears rise as she heard music she thought she had lost forever. When he finished, he looked up at her. She walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered. Those words stayed with him the whole night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking. The decision he had avoided for so long slowly became clearer. He didn't want to perform for the director. He didn't want to prove anything to the students. He didn't even want applause. He wanted to play for one person, his grandfather, and maybe, for the first time in years, for himself too. When the morning of the auditions arrived, he walked into the school building with a quiet sense of determination. He didn't tell anyone. He was going to try. He didn't need to. His steps were calm, but inside, his heart beat heavily with emotion. The auditorium was filled with students whispering loudly. Some were excited, some were mocking. The director stood on the stage, arms folded, waiting with a smug expression. And, as the boy entered the room, all the noise slowly began to fade. The auditorium was brighter the next morning, as though the sunlight from outside had followed the boy into the building. Students filled the rows in groups, their voices mixing into a restless hum. Some were nervous because they were performing. Others were just excited to see what kind of drama would unfold. The rumor about the quiet boy had grown so much that even students, who normally didn't care about school events, were sitting in the audience. The boy walked into the auditorium, quietly, holding a small folded piece of paper in his hand. He wasn't sure why he brought it. It didn't have anything important written on it, just a few notes he scribbled the night before. He didn't need it. But holding it gave him a strange sense of comfort, like holding on to something real in a moment that felt too big. His classmate, the one who had listened outside the community center music room, spotted him entering. Their eyes widened a little, but they didn't call out. They knew he didn't like attention. Instead, they simply smiled from across the room, a small smile that said, "You can do this." The boy gave a tiny nod back. It wasn't obvious to anyone, except that one person who understood how small gestures carried big feelings. The director stood on stage with an air of importance, wearing a long scarf he always wore during performances. He believed it made him look artistic and wise. He tapped his clipboard with a pen, loudly enough to express impatience. He scanned the room and saw students chatting excitedly. Then he saw the boy walking down the side aisle. For a moment, the director froze. Not out of fear or respect, but out of disbelief. He didn't expect the boy to actually show up. He thought the kid would ignore the whispers, stay invisible, and disappear into another quiet afternoon. Instead, here he was. The director lifted his chin and smirked, whispering something to a teacher standing beside him. The teacher didn't respond. Perhaps she had already heard enough of his jokes. The auditions began with a few dances, a guitar piece, and a poetry reading. The crowd clapped politely. Some students whispered loudly through the performances, too busy waiting for what they thought would be the main moment, the moment when the quiet boy would embarrass himself. The boy sat near the back, listening to each performer carefully. He admired the courage it took for them to step onto the stage. He didn't judge them. He didn't compare himself. He simply watched with calm eyes and hands that trembled ever so slightly in his lap. When the director finally called his name, the auditorium seemed to exhale. Students leaned forward. Some sat up straight for the first time all morning. Others whispered jokes under their breath. The boy stood slowly. His legs felt heavy, as though each step needed extra thought, but he didn't stop. He walked toward the stage with his heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. He kept his eyes ahead, not looking at the crowd. He didn't want faces to distract him. He didn't want to see the laughter or the doubt. He stepped onto the stage, and the wooden floor creaked beneath his feet. He had never been on a stage this big. The spotlight made the space feel warm and distant at the same time. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes watching him. The director crossed his arms dramatically. "So," he said loudly, "you're actually going to play something today?" His voice carried a mocking tone that dripped across the room. The boy didn't answer. He simply walked to the piano. It was a polished black upright piano, newer and much cleaner than the old one at home. He placed his fingers softly on the keys, testing them with a few gentle touches. The sound was crisp, pure, ready. Someone in the audience laughed softly, and the director cleared his throat as if preparing to enjoy the show. But the boy wasn't paying attention to any of that. He closed his eyes for one long moment. The noise from the audience faded, the brightness of the lights faded, and even the sound of his own nervous breathing softened. Instead, he imagined sitting next to his grandfather again. He imagined those warm mornings, the smell of tea, the dusty sunlight coming through the windows of their small home. He pictured his grandfather's kind smile, the way he would rest a hand on the boy's back and say, "Let the music speak for you." With that memory in his heart, he took a slow breath and began to play. The first notes floated out like gentle footsteps across a quiet room. Soft, careful, full of emotion. The room grew still almost instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the director straightened his posture. The boy's hands moved with confidence he didn't show in his daily life. Each note blended into the next, forming a melody that felt both fragile and strong. The sound filled the auditorium, but not in a loud or showy way. It filled the space like a warm breeze, touching every corner. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't flashy. But it was honest, and it carried. He could have chosen. Students in the audience stopped whispering. Some sat up straighter. Others leaned forward as if trying to get closer to the sound. Teachers exchanged quiet glances, surprised that a student they barely noticed could command the room so effortlessly. The director's smirk slowly faded. His eyebrows lifted. He leaned forward slightly. This wasn't what he expected. Not even close. As the boy continued playing, his nerves softened. His shoulders relaxed. His fingers glided across the keys as though guided by memory rather than thought. He didn't need to look at the piano. His hands knew the path, shaped by years of practice no one had ever seen. For a few minutes, the entire auditorium forgot everything else. Laughs, jokes, whispers, even the director's earlier promise. All that existed was the music. And then, when the boy reached the end of the piece, the final note rang through the air with a soft clarity that lingered just long enough to leave a breath of silence behind it. The boy lifted his hands gently off the keys. He didn't turn around right away. He took another breath, slow and steady, grounding himself back into the moment. When he finally turned, the auditorium was frozen. No one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because they were still, caught in the feeling of the music. They didn't want to break the moment too soon. The director stared at him with wide eyes. The scarf around his neck shifted slightly as he swallowed hard. For the first time that morning, he didn't have anything clever to say. It was the boy who broke the silence, though not with words. He simply stepped back from the piano, taking one small step away. That movement snapped the room back to life. Wave of whispers spread from the front row to the back. Some students gasped softly. Others covered their mouths. A few clapped hesitantly at first, then louder as they all settled into realization. The boy looked out at them, unsure how to react. He wasn't used to being watched, let alone admired. His ears felt warm, and his heart was racing now in a different way. The director cleared his throat. He seemed to struggle for words. His usual confidence faltered, and his voice came out. Unevenly, that was. Unexpected, he said slowly. Students exchanged looks. They knew that was the director's way of admitting he had underestimated someone. The boy didn't expect praise. He didn't expect anything at all. He only wanted to honor his grandfather. And now that he had done that, he felt calmer. Director finally spoke more directly. looking at the boy with a mixture of embarrassment and respect he didn't know how to show. "You? You may step down," he said, his voice softer than usual. The boy nodded gently and walked off the stage. As he passed rows of students, many eyes followed him. Some looked at him with awe, others with curiosity, and a few with guilt for having laughed earlier. He didn't hold anything against them. He wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking of his grandfather, imagining he would be smiling proudly when he reached the exit. His classmate from earlier stood waiting. They didn't say anything. They simply gave him a warm, grateful smile as he walked past. The boy didn't smile back, but his eyes softened. And for him, that was enough. He stepped out of the auditorium into the quiet hallway. For a moment, he leaned against the wall and let out a breath he had been holding since the moment his name was called. He didn't know what the director would say later. He didn't know how the school would react after the whispers turned into stories. But none of that mattered yet. For now, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet strength, and deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning of something he never expected. The hallway outside the auditorium felt strangely calm, almost too quiet compared to the noise inside. The boy stood there for a moment, letting his heart settle. He could still feel the warmth of the stage lights on his skin, still hear the final note he played echoing softly in his mind. It felt unreal, like he had stepped into a moment that didn't belong to the life he was used to. He walked slowly toward the drinking fountain and took a sip of water. His hands were still trembling, but not from fear. Something different stirred in him, something warm, something steady, something he didn't have a name for yet. While he was standing there, the auditorium doors opened and students began spilling out into the hallway. Their voices filled the air again, louder than before, buzzing with surprise and excitement. "Did you hear him? I didn't know he could play like that. That wasn't just good. That was something else." He didn't look up. He kept his gaze on the floor, hoping to blend into the background like always. But today was different. Today, people noticed him. A couple of students slowed down as they passed him. They didn't know what to say, didn't know if he wanted to talk, but they couldn't ignore him either. One of them murmured a soft, "That was amazing," before hurrying away as if unsure whether they should have spoken. He didn't respond. He wasn't ready for attention. Not yet. His classmate from earlier approached quietly. They didn't stand too close or move too fast. Instead, they took a careful step beside him and waited until he looked up. "You did really well," they said softly. He didn't know how to answer, but something in his eyes showed gratitude. They didn't push him for more. They knew he needed space. After a moment, the boy excused himself silently and walked out of the school building. He needed fresh air. He needed room to breathe. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm on his face. The sky was a soft shade of blue, and a gentle breeze passed through the trees, carrying the sound of leaves brushing against each other. For the first time in a long while, he felt light. Not happy exactly, but lifted like something heavy inside. Him had shifted. He walked home slowly, his mind replaying the moment when the entire auditorium fell silent. He hadn't expected that. He thought his playing might calm him, but he never imagined it would quiet a room full of people waiting to laugh. When he reached home, his mother was already there. She usually didn't get back so early, but today, she had left work a little sooner than usual. She took one look at him and sensed something was different. "How was school?" she asked gently. He didn't have the words to explain everything, so he just nodded and said, "It was fine." But his mother knew him. She could tell something unusual had happened. She didn't press him for answers. She simply walked over and hugged him, the kind of hug that felt warm and familiar, the kind that reminded him he wasn't alone. Later that evening, he sat at the piano again. His mother listened from the doorway with a soft smile. The house felt peaceful. The music made it feel even more so. But the calm wouldn't last. The next day at school, the atmosphere was completely different. People stared at him when he walked into the classroom. Some whispered behind their hands. Others just looked at him with a kind of curiosity he wasn't used to. He kept his head down and quietly took his seat. As soon as he sat, a student from across the room leaned over to another and whispered, "That's him. The one who played yesterday." He tried to ignore it. He opened his notebook and pretended to read. But it was impossible not to feel the change. One girl approached his desk and smiled nervously. "Your playing was really beautiful," she said. He blinked and nodded slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled and walked away. A few others followed with similar comments. Some were shy. Some were excited. Some were almost embarrassed for having doubted him. By lunchtime, word had spread even more. Students he had never spoken to before glanced at him with wide eyes or whispered his name to friends. Even teachers treated him differently, as though noticing him for the first time. He sat at his usual spot in the corner of the cafeteria. His classmate from earlier sat across from him. They didn't overwhelm him with questions. They didn't fill the silence with empty chatter. Instead, they simply sat with him, offering presence rather than pressure. "Are you okay?" they asked after a few minutes. He hesitated, then nodded. "It's just strange." They smiled softly. "People finally saw something in you. Something real. It's normal to feel weird about it." He looked down at his lunch tray. "I didn't expect them to listen." "They did," his classmate said. "And I think they'll remember what they heard." But not everyone was pleased. In the teacher's lounge, the director sat at a round table with a cup of tea. His scarf was neatly wrapped, and his expression was tight, as though he had bitten into something sour. Two teachers sat nearby, pretending not to notice his mood. "Are you all right?" one teacher finally asked. The director cleared his throat. "Of course, why wouldn't I be?" The teacher hesitated. "The boy's performance yesterday, it was impressive." The director tried to hide the flinch in his eyes. "It was decent," he said sharply. "Unexpected, but decent." "More than decent," the other teacher replied gently. The director frowned. He didn't like the idea of being wrong, especially not in front of students and fellow staff. He had made a bold promise, and now students expected him to kneel in front of the entire auditorium. He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't ready to admit he had misjudged someone so badly. Meanwhile, the boy returned to his community center shifts after school. The center felt safe, familiar, and unchanged by everything happening at school. He swept the floors, cleaned tables, sorted books, tasks he knew well. The staff greeted him warmly as always, unaware of the attention he was receiving at school. Later that evening, he slipped into the small music room. The old piano waited for him, its keys slightly uneven and its surface scratched from years of use. He sat down, took a breath, and played. The music flowed through him effortlessly, like it had been waiting all day for this moment. It helped him sort through the noise in his mind, the whispers, the curiosity, the stares. As he played, a soft knock came at the door. He froze. The door opened slowly, and his classmate from school stepped inside. They smiled gently. "I thought I might find you here," they said. He looked down nervously. "How did you know?" "You come here every day." And today felt like a day you'd want to be somewhere quiet. He didn't respond, but he didn't mind their presence. They sat on a chair nearby and listened as he continued to play. After a few minutes, they said softly, "You know, people are talking about you, in a good way." He gave a small breath of disbelief. "I didn't play for them." "I know, they said. But they still heard you. He continued playing, letting the notes speak for him. When he finished, he rested his hands on the keys and stared at them thoughtfully. Do you think they'll forget about it soon? He asked. His classmate shook their head. I don't think so. Something like that doesn't fade quickly. The boy sighed. He wasn't sure how he felt about being noticed. Part of him was proud. Another part was scared. Back at school the next day, something even more surprising happened. The principal stopped him in the hallway before class. I heard about your performance during auditions, the principal said with a warm smile. I'd like you to consider playing at the main school concert next month. It would mean a lot to the school. The boy froze. I don't know. The principal didn't push. Take your time. But you should know your music touched people. And that's rare. He nodded slowly and walked toward his classroom. Inside, the director stood near the chalkboard, looking distracted and uneasy. His eyes flicked toward the boy, then away quickly. During class, the director didn't call on him once. He didn't say anything mocking. He barely spoke to him at all. It was the first time the boy felt invisible in a different way, not ignored, but avoided. By the end of the school day, whispers had grown even louder. Not just about his performance now, but about what the director would do. Students argued about whether the director would actually kneel. Some said he had to. Others claimed he would find a way out of it. The boy didn't want anyone kneeling for him. He didn't play to make someone feel small. He didn't want conflict or embarrassment for anyone. He just wanted peace. But the situation was no longer just his. As he walked home that day, he felt the weight of everything growing heavier. The attention, the expectations, the director's discomfort. He wondered what his grandfather would say if he were here. Probably something simple, something wise, something like, you cannot control how others react to your gift. You can only control how you carry it. The boy took a long breath, letting that imagined calm settle inside him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew the music was becoming louder in his life again, and he wasn't sure if he was ready, but he wasn't going to run away from it either. The auditorium felt heavier than usual that afternoon, as if the air itself carried the whispers of all the expectations floating around. Students kept filing in, some out of curiosity, others because they had heard too many rumors and wanted to see if they were true. A few teachers decided to stay behind after their classes ended, pretending they had paperwork to do just so they could keep an eye on what might happen. And in the middle of all this buzz stood the boy, trying his best to stay still even as his heart raced, like it was chasing something he couldn't see. He wasn't nervous because of the audience. He wasn't even nervous about playing. What he really feared was the thought of disappointing someone who wasn't even there anymore, someone whose soft voice still echoed inside him whenever he doubted himself. His grandfather had always said that music wasn't about being loud or flashy. It was about honesty. And that memory became the only thing holding him steady as he moved toward the piano. The director stood nearby with his arms crossed, pretending he wasn't paying attention, even though everyone knew he was. He had mocked the boy earlier, and his words had already spread across the entire building. People repeated the line almost like it was a joke, that he would kneel right there if the boy could play. At first, the director thought nothing of it, but now he felt several pairs of eyes watching him, as if waiting for him to slip again. The boy didn't look at him. He didn't even look at the seats filling up behind him. Instead, he gently pulled out the piano bench, making sure it didn't scrape the floor. The small sound was enough to hush some of the chatter. He sat down slowly, his fingers resting on his lap, because he didn't want anyone to see them shaking. A few students whispered from the front row, wondering out loud if he would mess up. Others joked that maybe he would freeze, and the director would finally stop bragging. There were also a few who genuinely hoped he would do well, though they didn't say it too loudly, in case someone teased them for caring not. The boy took in a deep breath. It was the kind of breath someone takes when they know there's no turning back. He lifted his hands and placed them lightly on the keys. The piano felt familiar, almost like greeting an old friend who understood things without asking any questions. He softly exhaled and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the audience fade into a distant hum. When he opened his eyes again, he wasn't thinking about the director, the students, or even himself. He was thinking about a quiet living room from years ago, where he used to sit on a wooden bench that wobbled a little, and where his grandfather would gently tap his shoulder whenever he forgot to breathe while playing. With that memory guiding him, he pressed the first key. A single note floated into the room, steady and full. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange weight that made the nearest students stop whispering. The next few notes followed like a soft trail of footsteps, leading into the beginning of a melody that felt too mature, too deep to belong to someone his age. The director's eyebrows rose before he could hide his reaction. The boy continued playing, letting the music expand naturally, as if it had always lived in him, and now finally had a place to breathe. His hands stopped trembling the moment they began moving. They glided across the keys with a confidence nobody in that room had expected. The melody shifted from gentle to powerful, building into emotional waves that filled the auditorium with a warmth that held everyone still. The teachers who had stayed behind exchanged glances, wondering how they had never known about the boy's ability. One teacher, who had always believed talent should be nurtured gently, felt her throat tighten and had to blink quickly so no one would notice her eyes watering. Even the students who had mocked him earlier began leaning forward in their seats. None of them had imagined this quiet boy could make the piano sound like it was telling a story his story, without a single word dot as the music grew. So did the silence in the room. It wasn't the usual quiet that came from boredom or waiting. It was the kind that rose naturally when people recognized they were witnessing something special, something honest, something real. Halfway through the piece, the boy's expression changed. His eyebrows softened, his shoulders relaxed, and a calmness settled over him. It was as if he had stepped out of the auditorium and into a memory he didn't want to leave. The notes turned tender again, almost like a whispered conversation between him and someone who understood him better than anyone else ever had. A few students noticed this shift and felt a lump rise in their throats. They didn't know his story, but they could feel something in the music, something that made them think of times they had been afraid to speak, afraid to step forward, afraid to be seen. The director, who had started the day with pride and ego, wrapped around him like armor, found himself frozen. He had seen many students try to impress him over the years, some with flashy techniques, others with dramatic flourishes. But this was different. This wasn't performance. This was emotion. Made visible. The boy reached the final part of the piece, where the melody lifted gently before falling into a quiet, peaceful ending. His fingers moved slower now, savoring each moment, as if he wanted to hold on to the feeling for just a little longer. Then the last note came. It lingered in the air for a few breaths, floating softly before fading into the stillness of the room. Nobody moved. The boy slowly lifted his hands from the keys. For a second, he wasn't sure if he should stand or stay seated. He stared at the piano, half expecting his grandfather's voice to tell him he did well. But all he heard was the quiet breathing of the audience. Finally, he stood. The silence didn't break right away. People were still caught inside the moment, still processing what they had heard. Then, from the back row, someone let out a shaky breath, and it spread through the room like a ripple. A few students exchanged stunned looks. One teacher pressed her hand to her chest. The director blinked several times, as if trying to make sure. He wasn't imagining everything. Then the applause began. It started softly, almost uncertain, but grew into a strong wave that filled the entire room. Some students clapped because they were genuinely moved. Others clapped because they didn't know what else to do. But the sound was real loud and filled with something that felt a lot like respect. The boy stood still for a few moments, unsure of how to react. He wasn't used to attention. He wasn't used to being seen. But hearing the applause made something warm bloom in his chest. The director finally stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He seemed torn between pride, surprise, and something. That looked a lot like embarrassment. He had made bold claims earlier, claims he couldn't ignore now. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. For now, all that mattered was the boy standing quietly beside the piano, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. As the applause began to fade, the boy took a small step back from the piano and let out a breath he had been holding. He didn't smile, but his shoulders eased slightly, as if a heavy weight had finally slipped off. The director cleared his throat, signaling he had something to say. The room fell silent again, waiting. Not for the boy this time, but for the man who had doubted him. This was the beginning of the shift. The moment when everything in that auditorium started to change, not just for the boy, but for everyone. Watching him, including the one person who never expected to be proven wrong so completely. The room was still settling after the applause faded, as if everyone needed a moment to return to reality. The boy stood near the piano, unsure where to look. He wasn't used to having so many eyes on him. Most days, he walked through the halls, unnoticed, keeping to himself and blending into the background. But now, for the first time, people looked at him like he mattered. And though he didn't fully understand the feeling, it warmed something deep inside him. The director remained, at the front, frozen in place. For a long moment, he didn't move or speak. His pride had always been the thick wall he hid behind, and now that wall had cracked right in front of everyone. He had made a loud promise earlier, one he never thought he would have to face. People were whispering already, nudging one another and glancing at him with smirks or wide eyes. Someone in the back row whispered, "Is he really going to do it?" Another student quietly replied, "He promised." Everyone heard it. The director's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly and stepped forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he was dragging not only his feet, but also his pride across the floor. He approached the boy, who looked up with confusion, not knowing what was about to happen. Then, in a single motion that made the entire audience gasp, the director lowered himself to his knees. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Some students covered their mouths. A few teachers straightened in their chairs, surprised that he actually kept his word. The director bowed his head slightly and spoke quietly but clearly. "I judged you before I ever gave you a chance," he said. "And I was wrong." The boy blinked, stunned. He had never expected anything like this. He certainly never wanted anyone to kneel for him. His hands twitched awkwardly at his sides, and his throat tightened. All he could manage to whisper was, "You don't have to do that." But the director stood slowly and shook his head. "I needed to. Not for the audience, for myself." His voice wavered slightly, but he didn't hide it. For once, he wasn't trying to look strong. He was trying to be honest. A teacher from the side stepped forward and clapped once, not loudly, but with meaning. It broke the tension in the room, and soon others joined in. The applause wasn't for the performance this time. It was for the moment, for the humility, the honesty, and the courage it took for both of them to stand there. The director turned toward the boy again and said, "You're remarkable. I didn't expect that. I don't think anyone did, but I want to fix my mistake. If you're willing, I'd like to mentor you personally." The room quieted again, the surprise spreading like a wave. Students whispered things like, "No way," and "He's serious," while others simply stared. The boy didn't answer right away. He needed a moment. His thoughts were tangled between disbelief, gratitude, and a touch of fear. He had spent so long hiding his talent that suddenly being asked to step into the spotlight felt strange. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said. Softly, the director gave him a small smile, a real one, not the stiff, practiced expression he usually wore. "Good," he replied. The principal, who had entered the room halfway through the performance, but stood quietly at the back, stepped forward at last. She looked impressed, even moved. "If that's settled," she said, "I'd like to make an announcement." Everyone turned toward her. She had the kind of presence that made people pay attention. She continued, "I heard the performance from the hallway. It was powerful enough to draw me in, and I'm glad it did. I know our annual concert is only weeks away, but I believe he deserves a place in the main program, not as a backup performer. As a featured one." A ripple of excitement ran through the audience. Some students clapped again. Others simply stared at the boy like they were seeing him for the first time. The boy felt his chest tighten. Featured performer? That was more than he ever dreamed of. For years, he had played in private, tucked away from the world. Now he was being pushed into the center of something big. He swallowed and nodded again. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The principal smiled warmly. "You earned it." As she left the stage area, students slowly stood there, conversations buzzing. Some were excited, some were confused, and some were still shocked. But nearly all of them had a new sense of respect for the boy. A few came up to him afterward, offering quiet compliments or shy smiles. He didn't know how to respond to most of them, so he simply nodded and thanked them. A couple of students, who had made jokes earlier, avoided his eyes now, embarrassed by their own words. After the crowd started thinning out, the director approached him again. This time, his expression was softer. "You have something special," he said. "I want to help you shine, but I also want you to remember something." The boy looked at him curiously. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," the director said. "Your talent speaks for itself. Today, you didn't only play music, you made people feel something. That's rare." The boy nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not from someone like the director. It felt strange but comforting. As the last few students left the auditorium, the boy lingered behind. He walked back to the piano and gently touched the keys again. He didn't play, just rested his fingers on them. He wanted to remember this moment exactly as it was, the quiet room, the soft echo of applause still hanging in the air, and the faint sense of beginning something new. On his way out, he glanced at the empty seats. He imagined his grandfather sitting there, smiling proudly. The thought filled him with warmth. It reminded him that even though he had walked through much of his life feeling alone, he wasn't truly alone. The next day at school, everything felt different. People whispered as he walked by, but not in the way he was used to. Their whispers were curious, impressed, even admiring. A few students waved at him, and others gave small nods of acknowledgement. He didn't know how to respond, but he tried to smile when he could. Teachers treated him differently too. One of them stopped him after class just to say, "Your performance was beautiful." Another told him she wished more students could express their emotions the way he did through music. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. During lunch, a group of students invited him to sit with them. He had never been invited like that before. Normally, he ate alone near the back corner of the cafeteria, where no one bothered him. Now he hesitated, unsure what to do. One of them noticed his hesitation and said, You don't have to join us if you don't want to. We just thought you might like some company." The boy looked at their friendly faces and nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. Sitting with them felt new and unfamiliar, but they didn't pressure him to talk. They simply included him in their conversations, letting him listen when he didn't know what to say. Slowly, the nervousness inside him eased. Later in the day, the director pulled him aside again. "We start practice tomorrow," he said. "I want to prepare something special for the concert, something that truly represents you." The boy nodded. "I'll be there." That evening, when he returned home, his mother immediately noticed the shift in his energy. He didn't have to explain everything. She could see it in his eyes. She simply hugged him and whispered, "I'm proud of you." The boy held her tightly. It felt good to finally share something positive, something bright. That night, before going to bed, he pulled out the old notebook filled with his grandfather's music notes and scribbles. He flipped through the pages, touching the paper gently, as if it were fragile. Then, for the first time in years, he added a new note to the bottom of one page. "Today, I played again." He closed the notebook and placed it under his pillow. He fell asleep with a small smile, knowing that something had changed, not just around him, but inside him too. And while he didn't know what the concert would bring, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't hiding anymore. His music had finally stepped into the world, and it was only the beginning. The days leading up to the concert moved faster than the boy expected. Each morning, he woke with a mixture of nerves and excitement, and every evening he fell asleep feeling tired in a way that made him proud. It had been a long time since he felt this kind of purpose. Music was no longer something he kept hidden in the quiet corners of his life. It was something he shared, something he allowed others to see. Every afternoon, he met with the director in the music room. The director had changed since the day of the audition. He was still strict. He couldn't help that, but there was a softness beneath his instructions now, a respect, a patience. And sometimes, between moments of practice, he revealed small pieces of his own story, about how he had once been a young musician, just trying to be heard. The boy listened carefully, not because he felt obligated, but because he understood what it meant to carry something silently. It surprised him how much the director trusted him with those memories. It made the rehearsals feel less like lessons and more like a shared journey. Piece they worked on was not the same one he performed at the audition. The director wanted something new, something that represented the boy's growth, not just his skill. They mixed gentle melodies with powerful sections, creating a piece that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was emotional and hopeful, and the boy felt connected to every note. Each day, a few students lingered outside the music room, pretending to look for something in their lockers just so they could listen. The boy noticed them, but he didn't mind. For the first time in his life, he didn't fear being heard. On the final rehearsal day, the director stood beside the piano with his arms crossed, not in judgment this time, but in thought. When the boy finished playing the last note, the director quietly said, "You're ready." The boy breathed out slowly, a mix of relief and anticipation filling his chest. As they packed up, the director added, "Whatever happens at the concert, remember something. Music doesn't belong to the people who judge it. It belongs to the people who feel it. You make people feel. Never lose that." The boy nodded, absorbing every word. When he returned home that evening, his mother sensed his nervousness. She hugged him and whispered, "You'll do great. Just be yourself." He smiled softly. That was the part he was learning to accept being himself in front of others. The night of the concert arrived quickly. The auditorium looked different now. Rows of chairs filled the room, decorated with soft lighting that made everything feel warm. Parents, students, teachers, and community members filled the seats. The air buzzed with chatter, excitement, and on. The rustle of program papers. Backstage, performers practiced their pieces one last time. Some paced nervously. Others whispered with their friends. The boy stood quietly near the curtains, his hands clasped together. He could hear the muffled sounds of the audience beyond the stage, and his heart raced. The director walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's normal to be nervous," he said. "It means you care." The boy nodded. "I just don't want to disappoint anyone." The director shook his head. "You won't. You already played beautifully dozens of times. Tonight is just sharing it." A stagehand signaled that the boy should get ready. His performance was coming soon. He stepped closer to the curtain, peeking out at the large crowd. His breath caught. There were so many people, far more than he had expected. His chest tightened for a moment, but then he remembered the way music used to feel in his grandfather's small living room safe. Familiar, honest. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he wasn't afraid. His name was announced. The applause grew as he stepped onto the stage. The lights felt warm on his skin, almost comforting. He walked to the piano, pulled out the bench carefully, and sat down. For a moment, he just rested his hands on his lap, letting the room grow quiet. Then he placed his fingers softly on the keys. The first notes came out like a gentle breeze, soft, warm, welcoming. The audience leaned in, drawn instantly into the emotion behind each sound. The boy's hands moved smoothly, guiding the melody like he was painting something invisible in the air. As the piece continued, the emotion deepened. Soft tones blended with powerful crescendos, lifting the room into a world of feeling. Some parts sounded like memories, others like hope. The boy put pieces of himself into every note: his loneliness, his dreams, his gratitude, his quiet strength. People felt it. Parents wiped tears quietly. Students who once ignored him now sat stunned, wondering how they had missed someone like him. Teachers watched with pride. Even the director, standing off to the side backstage, felt a swell of emotion in his chest. The boy wasn't only performing. He was speaking through the music, telling a story without using words. Near the middle of the piece, the melody softened, drifting into a tender rhythm. It felt like a conversation between the boy and someone he missed. His grandfather's face flashed into his mind, kind, patient, proud. The boy's chest tightened, but he didn't stop. He let that feeling guide him, shaping each note with love. The audience could feel it too. Something about the softness in the middle of the performance pulled at their hearts. It felt vulnerable, honest, and deeply human. Then came the final section. The boy straightened slightly, letting the melody rise with energy and hope. The notes danced, bright and full, creating the feeling of stepping out of darkness and into light. His fingers moved faster, more confidently, until the final note rang out clear and strong. Silence followed, a long, breathless moment. Then the applause erupted. It wasn't like the applause from the audition. This one was louder, fuller, filled with emotion. People stood from their seats, clapping with genuine admiration. Some even cheered. The boy sat frozen for a second, overwhelmed. He had never imagined something like this. He stood slowly and bowed his head. The warmth from the applause wrapped around him like a soft blanket. When he walked off stage, the director met him immediately. Instead of saying anything, he placed both hands on the boy's shoulders and gave a proud nod. His eyes glistened slightly, though he tried to pretend they didn't. That, the director said softly, was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever witnessed. The boy lowered his eyes, shy but grateful. "Thank you." The director took a shaky breath. "No, thank you. You reminded everyone tonight what music really is." The boy didn't fully understand what that meant, but he felt the sincerity behind the words. After the show, people crowded around him. Students congratulated him, parents praised him, and teachers hugged him. Even people he barely knew shook his hand. He felt overwhelmed but happy, like he was standing in a place he had never imagined but somehow belonged to. When things finally calmed down, the boy stepped outside for a bit of fresh air. The night was cool, and the stars shined softly above. He stood there quietly, letting everything sink in. A moment later, the director joined him. They stood side by side in silence for a while. "You know," the director said eventually, "I wasn't sure what to expect when you first walked on that stage the other day. But you changed something in me, too." The boy looked at him, curious. The director continued, "I learned that talent doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits for the right moment, the right reason, the right courage." He paused before adding, "And I'm glad I lived long enough to witness yours." The boy didn't know what to say. He simply nodded. The director smiled and placed a gentle hand on the boy's back. "This is only the beginning for you." On the walk home, the boy felt lighter than ever. His mother wrapped him in a long hug when he arrived, tears in her eyes. She didn't have to say anything. He already understood everything she felt. That night, before sleeping, he opened his grandfather's old notebook again. He added a new line beneath the last one. "Tonight, I shared my music with the world." He closed the notebook and held it to his chest for a moment. Then he whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you." As he lay down to sleep, he realized something important. Music wasn't just something he did. It was part of who he was. And now, people finally saw him. His journey was just beginning, but he was no longer afraid. He had stepped out from the shadows, and the world had listened. And somewhere in the quiet, he felt certain his grandfather was smiling.